Lite. Tonight we pick up the story with Esther. And if you were on our Zoom calls last Thursday night, you'll remember that we talked about Esther was between a rock and a hard place. Remember, that meant that if you did one thing, it might end up kind of bad. If you did another thing, it might end up kind of bad. But what we said was, when we're stuck, God is not. Well, God is working his plan in Esther's life. And remember, God has a plan for our lives, but we have an enemy who plots to squish God's plan in our lives. And he was doing that in Esther's life too, but God had a plan for Esther's life. So you remember that where we left Esther was she was standing outside of the king's chambers, waiting to go in. I would imagine she was very afraid, don't you think? But finally, she gets brave and she walks in, and guess what the king does? He extends his golden scepter, which means you can come in. I'm not going to have you killed. I will listen to what you want to say. So when he extends his golden scepter to Esther, she touches the end of it, and the king says to her, Esther, what do you want? He must have been able to tell that she was afraid. And she said, King, I would love it if you and Haman would come to a banquet that I've prepared for you today. And the king says, okay. And he sends for Haman, and they go to this banquet that the queen has prepared. And while they're there, they're eating and they're drinking, and the king says, Queen Esther, what is it you want? I'll give you up to half my kingdom. And she says, King, if it pleases you, I would like you and Haman to come back again tomorrow to another banquet. Now you might be thinking, what? Queen Esther is supposed to be asking the king to save her people, and she's planning a party for him one day and then planning for a party for him the next day? Yes, but guaranteed God was working his plan. Guaranteed God planted that thought in Esther's mind and in Esther's heart to do a banquet one day and to do a banquet the next day, because God did some amazing things between the time of the first banquet and the time of the second banquet. So Haman goes home, and Haman's all proud. He goes home and he says to his wife and to some others of his close friends, I want to tell you what just happened. This is so amazing, because I and the king were invited to a banquet by the queen. And also, they invited me to come back again tomorrow. Just me and the king going to this banquet with the queen. And don't you know, I am really high up in this kingdom. And don't you know, I have great sons. And don't you know, I have lots of riches. Remember, another thing that we had said about Haman was he was super proud and puffed up and all about himself. And that continued on. Well, he was there, and he said everything would be really great if it weren't for that Jewish guy Mordecai who sits outside of the palace gate, and he won't even stand up when I walk by, let alone bow down. If he could be killed, everything would be fantastic. And Haman's wife and those friends that were around said, well, you know what you need to do? You just need to get rid of Mordecai. Why don't you build a tower, and why don't you make it 75 feet tall, and why don't you go to the king and say that Mordecai needs to be hanged on that tower because he's not willing to bow down like the king has decreed that he should. So Haman says, great plan. And he goes out to have this 75-foot tall tower built. In the meantime, it comes to be nighttime, and it's bedtime, and then while it's bedtime, the king can't sleep. And he calls for one of his servants, and he says, I want you to open up the book of the story of my reign as king, and I want you to read me a story. In other words, the king was saying, read me a bedtime story about how great a king I am. So the guy opens up the book, the history book of the king's reign, and he reads this story about the man Mordecai who overheard two of the king's men talking about how they wanted to have the king killed, and how Mordecai goes to the queen. The queen comes in to warn the king, there are these two men that are going to kill you, king. And Mordecai is the one who told me that plan. He's the one who heard. Do you remember that story? We talked about it a few weeks ago. How Mordecai had overheard those two men at the palace gate talking about how they wanted to have the king killed. Then they were two of the king's men. And Mordecai got the message to Esther, and Esther got the message to the king, and the king had those two men killed instead of those two men killing the king. Well, so while that man is reading that story to the king, he says, "What did we ever do to honor that man Mordecai?" And the guy says, "You never did anything, king." In the meantime, it's morning, and the king hears someone out in the outer courts, and he says, "Who's in the outer courts?" And the guy, the servant, says, "Well, that's Haman." And so he says, "Bring Haman in." Now remember, Haman was coming to ask the king to have Mordecai killed on those gallows on that tower that he had built. So the king, when Haman gets in the room, says, "What should I do for someone that I want to honor in my kingdom?" Well, we already talked about how Haman's super proud, and so he thinks, it's got to be me that the king wants to honor. So he thinks of this plan really quickly, and he says, "King, for the person that you want to honor, I think that you should take one of your royal robes that you have worn yourself, and I think that we should put the royal robe on that person, and then we should get one of your horses, and the horse needs to have some kind of symbol that shows that it's one of your horses on his head, and we need to put that person up on your horse, king, and we need to walk that person and the horse through the city saying, 'This is what happens to the someone the king wants to honor.'" The king says, "Great idea, Haman. I want you to go get Mordecai, who sits outside of the gate of the palace, and I want you to do exactly what you just said for Mordecai." Well, can you imagine how Haman must have felt? Remember, he was coming to ask the king to have Mordecai killed on the gallows. But he gets Mordecai. He puts one of the king's royal robes on Mordecai. He gets one of the king's horses that has some kind of symbol that shows that it's the king's horse. He puts Mordecai up on the king's horse, and Haman leads that horse with Mordecai sitting on it through the city saying, "This is what happens to someone the king wants to honor." The Bible tells us that Haman goes home completely bummed out, completely embarrassed, completely frustrated, thinking my plan has been squished. While he's home, while Haman is home, two of the king's men to come to get Haman to take him back to the palace for the next banquet that the queen has prepared. So while they're at the banquet, the king and Haman and Queen Esther are eating and drinking, and the king says to Esther again, "Queen Esther, what is it you want? I will give you half my kingdom." And Queen Esther says, "King, my people have been sold out to be wiped out, to be killed, to be annihilated. King, if all that had happened was my people had been sold out to be slaves, to be captive, I wouldn't even come to you. But King, we've been sold out to be killed, wiped out, and annihilated." And the king says, "Who would do such a thing as that to your people?" And Queen Esther says, "This evil man Haman that is sitting here beside you." The Bible tells us that the king is furious and that he goes out to the palace garden thinking of what his plan is going to be about what to do to Haman. And while he's out there, Haman stays inside with the queen begging for his life. And in the meantime, a couple of men come in and they put this covering over Haman's head, meaning you're doomed, buddy. And one of those men that had put the covering over Haman's head said, "King, Haman had a tower built 75 feet tall to have Mordecai killed on. The king says, then go hang Haman on that very same tower. And so they take Haman out and they hang him on that tower that he had built to hang Mordecai. Well, now you would think, woohoo, everything's good. But do you remember the king had put his signet ring on an edict, a ruling that said that the Jewish people would have to be killed and wiped out. And even a king couldn't change that ruling if the signet ring had been sealed on the edict. So they came up with a plan. And the king said, go get Mordecai. I'm going to make him my replacement for Haman. And the only way this ruling can be changed is that we have a new ruling. So Mordecai was brought in, he was given the king's signet ring, and they came up with a plan, an edict that said that the Jewish people could fight back anybody who was coming to kill them, anybody who was coming to murder them. The Jewish people could fight back. And they sent that ruling to all the different provinces of the kingdom. Now, it seems like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. And sure enough, the Bible tells us that even some of the people in the kingdom that weren't Jewish began to fight with the Jewish people because they were afraid of what the Jewish people would do to them. And so when people would come to try to kill the Jewish people, they would fight back and they won. They won. And so the Jewish people were saved. Do you remember what we talked about last week? What God had said about his people? That anybody blesses my people, I will bless them. And anyone who curses my people, I will curse them. That's exactly what happened to Haman. But God was working his plan the whole time. God was caring for his people. God was caring for Esther and Mordecai. God was protecting them. He was working his plan the whole time. They began to do a feast called the Feast of Purim, which was a 2-day festival celebration of what God had done. And they would share gifts of food and they would do things for the poor. And the Jewish people still celebrate the festival of Purim even today, remembering what God had done, how he had saved his people. Romans 8:28 says, God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose for them. God was working his plan. God was bigger than the enemy. But boys and girls, it's great for you to know the Esther story, but this is what I want you to know about your life. God is bigger than your enemies. God is bigger than the hard times. God is bigger than your struggles. God is bigger than your circumstances. And just like he did for Esther, God can take circumstances that even aren't good and work them together for your good if you love him and are called according to his purpose. God is bigger than anything that you face. So, Esther had a choice. Trust God or don't trust God. We have the very same choice. Trust God, understanding that he's bigger than anything we face, or don't trust him and try to do it on our own, which won't be successful. Esther's story is a really cool story about someone who trusted God and how God was working his plan the whole time. I want you to know that he will do the same thing in your life. Let me pray. God, thank you for your word. God, thank you that you're bigger than the things that we face. God, thank you that you tell us that even stinky circumstances, you can work together for good for those who love you and are called according to your purpose for them. So God, I pray for my friends that are watching. And I pray, God, that we would trust you and that we would remember that when we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, you are not stuck at all and that you are working your plan. Help us to lean into you, to trust you, to depend on you like Esther and Mordecai did. God, we love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Boys and girls, I want you to know that I love you. I miss you. I cannot wait to see you on June 14th, I hope. Fist bumping from afar, virtual hugging from afar, but in person, I hope. I love you. I'll see you on our Zoom meeting, I hope very soon. Have a great night.